got to play fair. You can't be throwing missiles and, the equivalent of, electronic missiles around without having repercussions. So forget the regulations. It's the only country that people can drive 145 miles an hour on their highways, even though they have, ruined an entire year of my life one time. When a lot of companies that go out of business, as a consultant here the last 3 years that, were not compliant. Information protection, data integrity, and, security being part of that. The digital health is something that is going to be, continued investment.
Hi guys, we are here with our second interview out of the series of interviews related to digital health. Our goal is to bring lots of useful information to all the digital health experts, startup founders that have decided to create a startup in this industry. And we're gonna talk today more about security and compliance of the software in general of startups. And our guest today is John Patterson. He has lots of years of experience in security in general. And I'd like to pass the word to you, John, so you can actually tell us more about your background.
All right. Thank you, Alex. So again, John Patterson, and yes, I have some security background. That's come relatively later in my career. I'm a biochemical engineer by training. I actually grew up on a farm in western Wisconsin, so I love watching things grow. My undergraduate was in agricultural engineering, and there were no jobs in the early 1980s. So I found a master's program at Purdue University where I wanted to get into the pharmaceutical industry. Wasn't successful initially. I went to the East Coast. I worked for a food subsidiary of Philip Morris called General Foods, which is now part of the whole Kraft organization. I think they've, moved on and probably labeled something else. And in the meantime, I was able to get a biochemical engineering position at Merck and Company. Started in Virginia, traveled to the Pennsylvania area where I worked in vaccines for years. I actually had an international assignment as well. And stayed there for a career, about 30 years, doing biochemical engineering, vaccine manufacturing, and then got into computers later in my career. I was always an automation person, and that internet came along, and I started, working in that space. And then I was the Chief Information Security Officer and head of the IT compliance for Merck KGaA of Darmstadt, Germany, from 2016 to 2018. And since that time, have been doing consulting in the GXP area with a focus on information protection, data integrity, and security being part of that. So it's all about how do you make sure you can meet regulations, the FDA regulations, with digital information. And so that's my background, and I'm very excited to be here, Alex. So yes, what do you have on your mind today?
I have a lot, but actually, before I go into my questions, 30 years in one company, wow, that's a lot. It's hard to believe that we can actually find people nowadays who worked in one company for 30 years.
Yeah. And so in my case, I had the advantage that it was a large company. So I was able to start out doing fermentation culture development, making cefamycin C and products like lovastatin and Primaxin and other things in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. Worked there for about 8 years, and then I was able to get up to the West Point, Pennsylvania area, which is where the vaccine manufacturing was, which I did for about 7 or 8 years, and then was able to get into corporate functions. I went to international assignment as a technical operations head at a chemical manufacturing facility we had in England. So I look at it, even though it was one company, it was very distinct experiences. And I think, a lot of it was the growth that you get when you get kind of thrown into a new area that's outside your comfort zone. But yeah, it was something that, it's unusual these days, but I think, for those of you that are still interested, that there is that opportunity. But at the same time, sometimes I wonder if it would have been better to go start something myself years ago. But that's no regrets. It's been a journey.
For sure. And actually, then 2 years in Germany, in Merck, Germany. Have you noticed lots of differences between working in Europe and in States regarding the regulations or the approach or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest difference is cultural. And, I grew up in a German American community that actually spoke German up until December 7th, 1941. And then after that, it was verboten to be spoken. In fact, it was no longer allowed. And so, from that growing up in that culture and then going to Germany, you can see that the cultural differences. I mean, America is an extremely diverse place, whereas you go to a place like Germany, it still is relatively, shall we say, monolithic culturally. And, it's the only country that people can drive 145 miles an hour on their highways. And to me, that's a cultural reflection of a country that, for example, values compliance with the regulations and having, risk-based regulations put in place. And then, the obviously some of the differences in terms of, the expectations. I love the time off that the European mindset has. Whereas in the U.S. It can sometimes be a little bit different. But yeah, certainly cultural differences. As you know, my wife is Ukrainian and have spent some time in Ukraine, your home country. And I think, another example of cultural differences. But at the same time, I look at it as, no culture better than any others. And I kind of think of myself as trying to be take the best aspect of every culture, because it's just good practice, best practice approach.
I agree, totally agree. All right. So actually, my first question that you've been helping people develop and adopt compliance technologies, in particular in biotech and pharma. Do you see any progress in the way companies treat compliance?
Well, I would just say that we still have, a bell-shaped curve in terms of some companies build compliance in as a fundamental aspect of everything they do. Other companies, not so much. I would say that forget the regulations and just whether or not you're passing your FDA or your, regulatory agency inspections. I think that because of the internet and because of more people going out, the Freedom of Information Act, you can go find some company's regulatory inspection record. You can retrieve it. They'll redact a little bit of information, but you can go see if somebody's doing their work or not. And I think as we're seeing, with the various products and initiatives out there, I think that more and more companies are realizing that having compliance and making sure you stay out of publications and newspapers and this sort of stuff, that's driving companies, good companies, successful companies, to ensure that regulatory compliance, especially in the FDA regulated industries, is inherent and adhered to. And not to say that people aren't taking chances there, because oftentimes there's the practical realities of they just have limited funds and they're not spending it as they're not able to spend it on some of these areas. The bottom line is that I've seen a lot of companies that go out of business as a consultant here the last 3 years that were not compliant, and it led them down a road they didn't want to go. So I think there is more incentive, but at the same time, there's probably because there's more healthcare companies. And especially in the field that I work in, data integrity, where computerized systems, it's the agencies are realizing, some folks are kind of playing games sometimes, and that's why there's this stricter enforcement and the focus in these areas. But I think in general, I think it's like anything, as a friend of mine used to say, smart people do smart things. And I think if you're going to be competitive and you're going to work in the health industry, you've got to be mindful of the regulatory requirements, especially as they relate to electronic systems and some of the things I know that folks watching this podcast will probably have interest in.
Why do you think companies that think that compliance should be an afterthought or should leave it for later, why they don't treat it too serious? Because they don't have enough money, or because they think they'll get back to this question later on, or why they don't do that?
Great question. And I think part of it is naivete. You oftentimes have people that come into especially from the computer industry, will come into the medical area, and they simply don't have the experience and understanding, and they're just naive about what the Food and Drug Administration regulations are about. And I think this is where, especially folks that may be, kind of coming at it from a purely practical standpoint, don't understand that, when you talk about Part 11 compliance as an example, there are very strict rules about how you maintain an electronic signature, how you maintain electronic records. So I think there's probably just people not fully understanding what's required. And what's nice for me to see is when you do get somebody who's totally outside the food industry or the regulated industry, the pharmaceutical industry, when once they understand what's required, oftentimes, they have a different perspective. And you may have seen recently, Elon Musk has made a play, and I don't know how far he's come on it, but he was actually supporting some of the efforts to manufacture the messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccine. Again, I don't know where that's at, but I think it's that kind of thinking that will help ensure that, we get better, improved technologies. But back to your initial question, I think some folks just don't read the books, don't get knowledgeable about what's required.
See. Since you've mentioned Musk, one of the greatest tech toppers ever nowadays, the next question is how to efficiently pitch a startup's product to the big pharma and other life sciences.
I think you have to have something that's differentiating, and you want to make sure that you're not just trying to improve the wheel, although that there may be some opportunities in that space. So I think the key thing, and being somebody who tries to learn as much about how Elon Musk made his way in the world, I think it's relying on first principles, knowing that you can demonstrate that you've really understood and researched the topic, and then of course having a strong economic backing, having something, a simple spreadsheet that shows, hey, this can work if these certain aspects, can be achieved. And I think, you want to avoid sort of like having a technology that's looking for a solution, it's looking for a problem. I think what you want to do is you want to make sure that, you understand a problem that exists in the industry, and you're going to go and develop some sort of technological improvement, process improvement, whatever, to deal with that problem. So I think it's making sure that you can demonstrate credibility would be my guidance. And those are the companies, as a consultant who sees small startups pretty regularly, the companies that get the venture capital are the ones that have those very clear business plans. And for somebody who's in the industry, it's pretty intuitively, obviously, quickly that is what you're selling. Does it make sense? Does it have an opportunity to really provide value and benefit to the big pharma company that you're trying to sell it to?
Got it. Tell us about, in general, life sciences relationships with software vendors and different startups. What are in general, how long do the deals go? What are the longest stages and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would put those, kind of in two categories. I mean, there's, the larger, more established pharmaceutical companies are using, software as a service for more and more of their business. And, and they're interested in companies that can add things on. So, there's the obvious ones, Veeva, Microsoft Azure, Oracle, their clinical products. There's all kinds of opportunities there where those companies, biopharmaceutical companies, are using them for cloud services. That's kind of old news. I think the new one, and this is where, as a consultant, seeing more and more about it. So I'm not in a position to mention individual companies, but these are the companies that are making applications that are medical devices. And, these are the apps, I think everybody knows, that Apple's trying to get their apps that take your heartbeat and do all this stuff. And then there's a whole set of companies, and this is a very exciting area, that, are starting to try and get you to stop eating too much, or helping treat mental disease, all kinds of things that are based on, applications that you have to respond with, maybe taking biometric information where it's available. And to me, as someone who watched the original 79 episodes of Star Trek starting in 1966 from a TV station we got out of Eastern Iowa, KCRG, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. For anybody who's an Iowan, they may remember that they may still be there. But anyway, being a believer that all that stuff from Star Trek's going to come true, to me, I just see the future of our medical process is all about information management, being able to get the information that matters, and then being able to give you predictive capabilities about what's going to happen, with your health. And I think this is where, the most exciting areas that I've seen out there. There are companies that are doing artificial intelligence to help with all kinds of things in the pharmaceutical industry, helping determine the opportunities for development and, things that I have an interest in. Can you validate artificial intelligence as an example? And it's like, probably not. These are like investigative tools, but they are investigative tools that will give you data that will be able to be then used by medical health professionals or yourself to help ensure that you can improve your health. So that's kind of the two areas that I see, sort of the classic, software as a service where, everything in their, companies don't want to deal with IT. They want to get it out there. And I think that's the good strategy for a lot of items. And then of course, you have this digital healthcare, which is, I'm looking for Elon Musk to come in here with artificial intelligence and something you implant. And, suddenly it's like, wow, you may have a whole nother level of information and knowledge about what your body's doing.
And you've mentioned software as a service. So the question is, what's better, to pitch a product as software as a service to a life science company when it's just starting operations, or trying to joining in when it's already mature?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends. And I mean, that software as a service, there's so many aspects to that in terms of, for example, I've seen where there's a lot of opportunities for companies that help smaller biopharmaceutical companies manage and use software as a service. So they, one of the requirements in the regulated industries is that if you're using somebody else's software, you have to have an understanding of when they make changes to the software and do an impact assessment onto what it means to your operations, however you're using that software. And so I've seen companies very successfully launch that really do nothing other than review the software changes from the software as a service provider. And then they contract with the small company and they do the evaluation and tell them, don't worry about that. And then they efficiently manage the paperwork. And management of paperwork is another area that I've seen some small startups where they simply are far more efficient, and they do that as a service in the pharmaceutical industry. Because, and this is where it's like anything. If you're not very good at something, let someone else do it, and you can be in a better position to make sure that you do it more efficiently. Now, that said, I think depending on where you operate in the world, you got to be really careful about intellectual property loss. And I've had some direct experiences with folks where, with the best of intentions, they've had key intellectual property go missing because they've been using third parties that in the end were there as really probably extensions of governments that were deciding to try and get certain information. And I think that is a systemic issue. It's a highly publicized and political issue. And I think something that, got to be very mindful of if you think you got really important, information.
But for example, for a big pharma, would they be more open to actually find that SaaS solution or develop them on their own, like you said, to protect their IP, basically?
I don't see anybody competing with the Vivas and the Amazons and the Oracles and all those folks that are developing, the clinical systems and pharmacovigilance. You don't have to. I don't think that's a realistic way, to approach it. I think what companies have to do is they have to get a lot more savvy about how they maintain their intellectual property, who they're hiring, how they can monitor their employees without breaking privacy regulations, Making sure that it's, if you see, I mean, a very good one is that you require labeling of your information, you classify it appropriately, and that if something is, top secret, it doesn't leave the organization, or if it does, you have ways of tracking it. So hopefully that's addressing the question, if I'm understanding it right. But I think in general, it's, companies are not going to want to develop and keep everything in house, because there's such a loss when you're not able to be out there in the open environment using the best available technologies. In the electronic space, you may find yourself, you simply can't conduct a clinical trial like your competitor is doing, for example.
I see. And following that question, there are lots of small startups creating different products for big pharma or biotech. Do you think they have better chances nowadays in 2021 to actually get that cooperation with big corporations than before, or there's still lots of long way to go till small startups can actually cooperate with big companies?
This is in a space of cybersecurity, or just general applications?
General application related to digital health.
Yeah, to me, I mean, my perspective is that there's never been more opportunity for digital health than there is today for small companies to engage larger companies. Because I think in some ways you do have what was going on in the early internet days, when, these big brick and mortar companies, as they used to say, had no freaking clue about the internet, and they knew they needed to be there. So I think there's probably just a market for people that want to learn and get into it. So, kind of thinking of an entrepreneurial opportunity, there's probably things you can sell, just because companies who may not be very high on the maturity level in terms of their understanding of it, they just want to understand. They want to get in there and they want to have something. So I think, my view is the digital health is something that is going to be, continued investment. I'm seeing, companies, some folks that, again, I'm not allowed to, I can't speak about it in this interview, but you can go Google it and they're out there. I mean, companies that are really starting to develop the apps, and, these apps, they're medical devices. And so they got to have, and this is where, as someone who knows a little enough to be dangerous about security and computer validation in the medical area, they got to have all those controls in place. And, those are things that big companies spend millions and millions of dollars on, whereas a small startup can come in and do that much more effectively. And to me, if I was an entrepreneur in that space, I would be very much attuned to how advances in the ability to measure things. And, for example, this, the ability, and it goes back to Star Trek, they had, Bones, the doctor had that thing that he just sort of took over to somebody, and it measured their heart rate and everything, all their vitals. And I think that reality, that is going to continue to develop. Now, how fast it develops, I mean, that, we'll have to see. But the point is, as that ability to measure things improves, and, societal improvements in standard of living are very much tied to the ability to new materials and the ability to measure things. And so as that measurement continues to improve, materials and the ability to get, better sensors are out there. To me, there's just an infinite amount of opportunity and innovation, because you're going to have suddenly, somebody in a lab somewhere, maybe for a totally non-medical purpose, develops a new way to measure something. And to me, that's the entrepreneurial opportunity in the whole space of, medical diagnostics, and just better ways to manage our health.
Okay. The next question is, how do you think how GxP compliance changed in the last years? Were there any changes in general, especially during the pandemic?
Well, I would say, and this is I have nothing but the highest level of respect for the FDA, the US FDA, even though they have, ruined an entire year of my life one time when they told me I couldn't run a factory anymore. But that aside, they are an incredible organization, in my opinion, because they really follow the law, and they pride themselves on enforcing the law. And so I think that, for example, using the pandemic, they enforced the law and they were able to use the emergency approval of medicines in the way it was intended, which is, hey, if you've got a major health crisis, we're not going to wait 4 years. We're not going to do all. We are going to use a risk-based, science-based decision. So I think the FDA has done a fabulous job, in this pandemic. And, there were emergency approvals of some medicines that when they did the double-blinded study, they didn't have the effectiveness. So they didn't go ahead and approve it for that indication. Now, if you want to approve something, if a doctor wants to subscribe something off-label, that's their choice. It happens all the time. So I think the FDA has done, in my opinion, a fabulous job. They are very focused. They're extremely hardworking, dedicated, science-based folks. And I think they're doing, the right risk-based approach, but maintaining the law. The law has not changed. And I think, as you saw in the dynamics of U.S. presidential elections last year, people were claiming that the sitting president was going to get the vaccine approved. And it was like, no, that's not the way it works here. Now, I think it is the way it works in other countries around the world. And I think that, I was especially pleased when the Sino, the Chinese Food and Drug Administration, they actually adopted the U.S. regulations around in the pharmaceutical industry, because I think they are really, really good. And if you've got a culture and a system that applies the rules as they're written and uses a risk-based approach and risk management and considers extenuating circumstances, et cetera, and has a very strong pharmacovigilance reporting process to make sure that when you do have something that's abnormal that you didn't pick up in the clinical trial, you're very quickly able to respond to that. So I think, back to your original question, I think the system has worked. The system has been used as it was intended, and hats off to everybody in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, in my view.
All right. Let's talk about cyber attacks a little bit. Can you please tell several examples, or one example, about the most devastating cyber attacks or data breaches that actually that you've encountered, and how the companies you've been working with have dealt with them?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, for a personal story, I had my personal computer in 1997. I was living in England, and there was a worm that came in and totally destroyed my computer. So that was my introduction to computer viruses. So I've had a practical working knowledge of them for some time. So I think a couple of ones that are noteworthy, the NotPetya that happened in June of 2017 in your native Ukraine. I think that was a classic case of, there's a war going on. And I think this reinforces the aspect that's the scariest part about cyber attacks, is if you're at war with somebody and there's a war going on in Eastern Ukraine, as you well know, and that NotPetya was engineered into a tax accounting software, unbeknownst to anybody other than the attackers, and that was launched directly into the Ukrainian banking system and hit a whole bunch of companies that happen to have offices in Ukraine. To me, that's like the worst case scenario. That did, and in fact, and I'm not even sure that the people that designed it realized that it would happen, but it did far more damage outside of Ukraine, because the Ukrainian banking system, Ukrainians are tough and they're used to hard times, and they recovered quickly. There were companies, huge companies. I don't want to mention any names here, but you can go Google it. They couldn't get their ships to unload. They couldn't make their pharmaceutical products. They couldn't make their candy bars. All kinds of huge impact. So that's one that really sticks out. And I think it's an example, and it ties back to vulnerabilities. The Microsoft operating system were made public, and then somebody picked up on it. I think the other one, and this one also has, a connection to our, as you say in Ukraine, our beloved Russian brothers. And I don't want to offend anybody who's Russian, because I have lots of good Russian friends. But the SolarWinds, which that was an attack. I don't think we understand the scope of that. And I should be fair. The Russian government claims they had no impact and no involvement with that. But SolarWinds was penetrated, and they were able to get access to Microsoft, Department of Defense. And so I have a feeling my records, some of the stuff that I have is sitting somewhere in somebody's secure system. And I think this is a lesson for all of us. And I think we just have to be more vigilant. And, we also have to treat it as, if you really want to go out and damage things, this is something you can continue to do. And I think we have to have a diplomacy and some sort of fair games, just like we did with nuclear weapons. I mean, we aren't tossing nuclear weapons around because we know, that's mutually assured destruction. And I think there's an element of that with the internet. If we want to go to war on the internet constantly, and we can as nations come to not do that, that could be problematic, and it could limit us as a species.
And going back to kind of my actual first question, healthcare is still one of the most targeted industries in terms of cyber attacks, of course, and the pandemic has actually made it worse. What do you think should be done to fix the situation on the hospital side, on the regulatory side, on the side of the third-party vendors, or all of them altogether?
That's a great question, Alex. And I can say, as someone who's had the privilege to help support some of the COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers, the one thing we know is that they were extremely heavily targeted by various unnamed nation states. And this wasn't some hacker and these were concerted efforts to try and figure out how to get messenger RNA vaccine technology, adenovirus vaccine technology, and from my firsthand experience with it it's you kind of got to know the neighborhood that you're going into. And if you've got systems out on the internet, you need to have it protected, and you got to have web application firewalls for your websites. You got to have firewalls. You got to make sure you got second person, multi-factor authentication. And, to me, and to answer your question directly, I see it as, it's just like flying a plane. If you fly a plane around, commercial plane as an example, there's rules you got to apply. And if you don't apply those rules, there's going to be somebody come and tell you that if you don't, they're going to tell you to stop doing it. And, to me, I mean, for example, multi-factor authentication and making that a reality for every time you log into a system, like the banking system requires, that we've got to get to some level of that. Otherwise, it's so easy to get somebody on a phishing attack to tell you their credentials. So I think there's some opportunity for some level of regulation and ensuring that if you've got critical infrastructure, and there are laws out there, it's just a question of, is the enforcement harsh enough that it's actually having any effect, and are people really taking it seriously? It's kind of like back to the original question you had about GXP compliance. I mean, people are going to do what they want, and there's no, and so I think that's one aspect. And then the other one, I think, is a political diplomacy type thing, where we, as nations and as people that live on and occupy the same planet, we have to have some controls and make sure that if somebody's out there doing some really nasty stuff on the internet, really screwing stuff up, and I mentioned one earlier, that there's implications to that, and that you can't, you got to play fair. You can't be throwing missiles and, the equivalent of, electronic missiles around without having repercussions. So that's where I kind of see there's a lot of different things that we have to apply to it. But I think it's good to see that if it's pretty clear that one particular country may be responsible and condoning or actually supporting and getting information from something, that ought to have implications.
And to wrap up our great conversation, my last question would be, 2020, digital health out of necessity became actually the accepted way of receiving care. Do you think after the whole pandemic ends or close to the end, will all those changes stick and people continue using digital health, or something will go away or actually or going to develop?
Oh, I think your question is a great one. And I think yes, I think digital health, like a lot of things, digital has been sort of gotten a steroid boost, or kind of some tailwinds, if you will. And those tailwinds are going to continue. And I think there's no doubt that people are more comfortable with doing things remotely, doing things on a computer, putting information into a computer system. That's becoming, easier and more, you know, it's just common practice now. And so, yeah, I think there's a great opportunity out there. And I think, to the young budding entrepreneurs that are looking to try and, get these tailwinds, I think, the more they can get something that's easy to use, few number of clicks, gives you some real credible information and or advice. I think there's incredible opportunities out there, for those types of applications. And, just as we've seen in general, I mean, companies that are digital on average did better of the pandemic, and, for the obvious reasons. I mean, this is something where we couldn't touch each other. We couldn't go shake hands. We had all those limitations. And, for those of us that have been doing these types of Zoom sessions for 2 decades, I can honestly say I was the only person in our company that had Net Meeting. And I got people configured at Net Meeting, and I did remote training sessions. And this was in August of 2020, or I'm sorry, 2000, August of 2000. And people thought I was crazy. It's like, don't you want to fly someplace? No, we're going to do this remotely because, I had a small child at the time and I wanted to stay home and do this stuff in the middle of the night rather than be flying all the way across the world. And so I think we all understand. I mean, that's the norm of humanity now. And I think it'll continue.
Well, still, I think at some point soon I'll be able to meet you in person and shake your hand. But yeah, now in terms of our reality, I agree that digital health is definitely going to stick and just going to progress. And hopefully we're going to help promote the compliance and make sure that startup founders and other companies and enterprises don't leave it as an afterthought when actually they get hacked or they have a data breach. Thank you, John. It was a great conversation, lots of great insights, and hope to hear from you soon.
Great talking, Alex. Good seeing you again. And let's see, Auf Wiedersehen, goodbye, do svidaniya, paka, and any other. Anyway, take care, and look forward to connecting again soon. And hopefully for those of you that are seeing this, hope you get something out of it. And if you want, certainly if anybody's interested in contacting me, Alex, you can provide my contact information. And always love hearing about new opportunities and challenges in this space.
Great. Thank you.